Bonsoir tout le monde UX. Je m'excuse, je parle un petit peu de français, mais je ne peux pas faire la conférence en français, alors je vais changer en anglais. J'espère que tout le monde peut répondre. First of all, I want to thank, I know we were trying to get everyone from Tout le monde UX. I want to do a better job than you. So I want to thank Alain, Anastasia, Jean-François, Sarah, Yudom, Catherine, Perrine, David, Morgan, and everybody else who's been organizing 38 of these, I think, right? This is the 38th Tout le monde UX. It's my favorite UX meetup in Canada. I come to this one all the time. I take the train back the next morning because the content is always amazing, and I'm delighted to be here. So, but before we start, can we just give some applause to Tout le monde UX? A little bit about me, and this is just one slide. You can find me online. This is my Twitter account. That's where I mostly roam. Those are my online coordinates. And as Don was saying, I run a small business consultancy called Amplitude, but I started working on enterprise scale problems a long time ago. So I used to lead the UX practice at Deloitte Consulting up until about 10 years ago, and then I was the UX practice lead for Shotgun Communications in Calgary. And a lot of the projects that we were working on in both of these enterprises were really, really big, wicked type problems. So that's when I started realizing that the typical tools that we know as designers, so if you think about your typical design thinking methods, from research to ideation, to discovery, to prototyping, to testing, all of those sort of traditional methods weren't really working very well. So when I started looking into how we can be better, how we can be more useful to the business as designers. Now, you guys notice I have an accent. That's because I'm originally from Transylvania. It's nighttime outside, so some of you may be in trouble. Hopefully everybody's going to be alive. Why are we here? I also do part of what you're seeing today. I also do as part of a couple of different workshops that I'm doing related to systems thinking and ecosystem mapping. But when I do these workshops, one of the first things that I do is I ask people, why are you taking this workshop, right? Because typically, systems thinking, ecosystem mapping doesn't fall under the usual cachet of what designers do. And the most common answer that comes up is always, we want to learn how to deal with complexity, right? Why do we want to learn about complexity, how to deal with complexity? Because individually and collectively, we know far less about the world than we like to admit. So we all have this sort of imposter syndrome when we start a new project in a new industry that we know nothing about. And we're trying to sort of ramp up really quickly on that knowledge. We're trying to ramp up about all the things all the lingo that we need to know, all the procedures, all the processes that are related. But when push comes to shove, we're newbies, right? We're starting to sort of ramp up, and there's better ways to ramp up than jumping straight into the typical design deliverables that we tend to work on. A few months ago, there was a report that came up from Pearson Education, Nexta, and Oxford Martin that was called the Future of Skills Report. And they were looking at the skills most in demand up to the year 2030. And you can see a number 8 there. It says complex problem solving. That's fantastic. Usually humans always need to get better at complex problem solving. But the two items that are really of interest to me are number 4, systems evaluation, and number 9, systems analysis. So systems evaluation, they define it as determining how a system should work and determining how the conditions can affect its outcomes. And then systems analysis is more about how to manipulate the outcomes of a system. Now, notice they say needed to improve or correct performance. I don't know about you guys, but when I look at how systems perform in the world, they don't necessarily improve or correct performance. In fact, in a lot of cases, the systems that we have in place actually work against humanity. I don't know if you're familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. These are sort of the 7 goals that the UN put on their action plan until the year 2030 to make the world a better place for humans. Now, if you were to read all of these, you realize that 16 of the 17 are system-level problems, right? These are not small problems. How would you tackle one of these as a designer, right? If you think about it, if you're a product designer and you want to improve a particular product, that might make a little dent, but ultimately, will that make a huge dent into this, or will that be just a small incremental way of looking at the problem? I was at the conference, this is about a year and a half ago, and this was about a 1-hour presentation by a really well-known US company based out of the US Northeast. And they were talking about this project that they have where, they have a big team, they work for a few months, probably for a lot of hundreds of thousands of US dollars, and the deliverable was a 46-foot journey map. For those of you who are really challenged, that's 14.1 meters. Now, they presented this as a success. I was sitting at the back of the room and looking at this, presentation. They were saying, well, I have this journey map. It starts on this wall. It goes all the way around, and it ends like right here, right? And they were saying that, this is what we built, and this is amazing. We researched this, and we've done a really good job. And I'm sitting there at the back thinking, none of my clients, I tend to work with fairly large corporations, none of my clients would ever have the patience or the audacity to give me money to build them a rod like this. Right? I don't even understand how they put it up on the wall. Like, imagine how many designers it takes to put a journey map up on the wall. Anyway, so that's one example of us using the wrong tool trying to answer a system level problem potentially. In the last little while, people talk about systems and ecosystem all the time in presentations. What you see here on the top left is what Disney thinks their ecosystem structure is. So they have a bunch of products, they have a bunch of line businesses, they have a bunch of iterations, they have a bunch of platforms. Now, if you look bottom left, this is what Pitney Bowes thinks their ecosystem is. It's basically a bunch of physical devices, a bunch of software, a bunch of accessories, mobile apps, integration with some third-party tool, and then in the middle, somehow, I don't know if it's just a random placement, but they have a bunch of common, UX, common workflows and UI approaches, and then a bunch of metadata. So if you look at the top right, that's what Macadamia, which is another US consultancy based out of Ottawa, thinks their ecosystem app is, and that's probably the closest to how I understand what an ecosystem app is. In the middle here, you have what Amadeus, the European travel company, thinks their ecosystem app is, and that is not like an in-between slide, that's the final slide that they were showing. Notice there's a lot of empty circles. Nobody that I asked at that presentation about what this was about could actually tell me what this was about, but they had a 1-hour presentation about this particular process. And then at the bottom right, you have the sort of the prototypical old school ecosystem maps. I apologize, it's kind of behind the other one. But it's basically a circle that's sliced into 6 pizza slices, and then there's 5 swim lanes. And that appeared for the first time in Andy Boulain's service design book, and then was copied by Jim Kalbach in his mapping experience book for Riley Media. And when I started looking into systems and systems mapping, I started talking to Jim about this particular representation. I asked him, can you walk me through how you built this? Because in your book, for every single mapping technique that you have about a page, minimum a page of explanation about how that's done. But somehow for this ecosystem map, you have a paragraph. And all you're saying is it's an ecosystem map and it contains the things that are listed on it, but it didn't really give much more explanation about putting it together. And he told me he has no clue. So I was like, okay, interesting. So I started doing my own sort of research, trying to figure out how to work within systems as a designer and how to tackle specifically the problem of ecosystem mapping. One of the first things that I ran across when I started reading books about the subject is a book called Growing Wings on the Way, Systems Thinking for Messy Situations. And that was written by Rosalind Armstrong. And she mapped out the way we solve problems, the way we design, on two different axes. On the y-axis, we have the number of perspectives from which we look at the problem. So you can look at a problem from a single perspective, or you can look at a problem from multiple perspectives. On the x-axis, she has thinking, the way we think about the problem. So we can think about the problem in a reductionist way, or we can think about the problem in a holistic way. Now, how many of you here are familiar with reductionism? Not many, okay, so I'm going to walk you through it. Reductionism is basically trying to understand something by breaking it down into internal structures and breaking those down and trying to understand how they all individually work together. So if you, I apologize if anybody owns like a 90-ish Volkswagen Golf, I'm not trying to threaten your car, but one way that you could understand how your car works is to break it apart into components and break those components into their components, and eventually you get down to something like this, and then try to put it all back together. Or you can look at that problem holistically, and you can say, well, the car itself is a number of pieces that are interconnected. So you have an engine, you have a transmission, you have an electrical system, you have a fuel system, you have a drivetrain, right? Understand how those work together, how they propel, like how propulsion works, and then worry less about the individual pieces and how they all sort of work together. I don't know about you, but in this particular case, looking at things holistically works a little bit better than being reductionist. Now, she labels these quadrants, so single lens reductionist thinking is called scientific or mechanistic thinking, and this has a very privileged way in the Western society because this is how science, this is what science is based on, right? So humanity has advanced from, the Bronze Age until, late 80s, late 70s, simply by doing single lens reductionist scientific thinking. However, when you look at a problem from multiple perspectives, but still in a reductionist way, that's called socio-mechanistic thinking. And that is, if you think about social sciences, right? Social sciences look at a problem from a perspective of, from a financial perspective, from a psychological perspective, from a social perspective, but still break those down in a reductionist way. When you look at a problem from a single perspective, but holistically, that's just called holistic thinking. I don't know if Rosalind ran out of inspiration, but that's what she called it. The typical stuff that falls into that quadrant is ecological science. So if you think about ecology, you're looking at all the different elements that make up an ecological set of elements or system, but you look at them from simply the perspective of ecology. You don't look at it from any other, you don't look at it from an economic perspective, social perspective, and so on. And then when you look at a problem from multiple perspectives and you look at a problem holistically, that's where system thinking comes in. Now, that's fine and dandy, it's a bunch of definitions. How is that helpful? So I decided to overlay the way we reasoned to this, to Rosalind's quadrants. So when we look at how we reason, within scientific thinking, socio-mechanistic thinking, and holistic thinking, the type of reasoning that we employ is either deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning. Now, deductive reasoning, you're all probably familiar with. This is what we're being taught in school. This is sort of typical logic that's focused on causality. So if A always implies B and B always implies C, then A always implies C. Right? So that conclusion, A implies C, is a guaranteed conclusion. It's 100% of the time, if you follow that type of deductive reasoning, you will arrive to the right conclusion. Inductive reasoning is the type of reasoning that designers typically apply. So when we try to prove a hypothesis or a theory based on research, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, right? And we're trying to basically infer whether that theory or that hypothesis is right or wrong, that's what's called inductive reasoning. Now, unlike deductive reasoning, the conclusion is likely guaranteed, but sorry, I should say that the conclusion is just likely going to always happen versus always happening when we're talking about deductive reasoning. When we're talking about system thinking, there's another type of reasoning that comes into play, and that's called deductive reasoning. Now, deductive reasoning tries to generate explanations from an incomplete set of observations. So if you think about doing research at a system level, it's impossible to research the problem completely. It's impossible to talk to every single actor in the system, figure out map out every single service in the system, understand every single pathway, understand every single possible permutation that system can show you. So when we're talking about deductive thinking, the conclusion is a shot in the dark. Right? Jesse James Garrett talks about, this is sort of my favorite quote from Jesse, when he says, if designers want to become good designers, they have to have a capacity for discomfort, right? And that's a lot of times that's what he's talking about. This sort of deductive reasoning, being able to take a shot in the dark based on incomplete data, and incomplete research, and trying to solve a bigger problem than the typical problems that we're familiar with. Here's an example of that. Are you guys familiar with the Dog Cafe? So the Dog Cafe is this cafe in Tokyo. And instead of having human wait staff, they have robots, right? So when you walk into this cafe, you're going to have a little robot coming in and taking your order, you're going to converse with it, and it's going to walk, it's going to, I don't know if it walks away or it rolls away. It's going to roll away and then come back, bring your order. Then it's going to, when you're ready, they're going to go. It's going to come back and ask you, give you a bill. You're going to pay it, and so on. Right? If you think about it, that changes a little bit the system of, I guess, customer service in a particular environment like this. But it doesn't change it the way you think. All these robots are being controlled by paraplegics. So somebody thought about how can they make their lives a little bit more meaningful, and how can they make paraplegics to be gainfully employed. And they came up with this idea, and they've done a little bit of research, but they didn't really know whether this was going to work or not. This was a shot in the dark. This was a shot in the dark at the system level. And the amount of positive publicity this got, and the amount of goodwill that this has gotten them, this was a 3-month pilot, and now they're trying to sort of make it a more permanent endeavor, and other people around the world are being inspired by what they're trying to do as well. Now, I'll stop for just a second. On your tables, there's a bunch of pens, there's a bunch of little not post-it notes, but just sort of notepads. Can you guys all make sure you have one in front of you? I don't want to talk by myself for an hour, so I'm going to make you do something. It's going to be a little exercise. I'll give you 15 seconds to get one of those. And Dom has extras if you guys have extras. And if you don't have any, you can use your phone, you can use your memory if you like. Okay, everybody got one in front of them? Okay, don't do anything, just look at the slide, please. All right, so what I want you to do is I want you to write down as many words as you can remember from the previous slide, and the order is not relevant. So I'll give you a minute for that. Because if you remember more words than you can write down in a minute, then you'll really good. This is an individual exercise, not a group exercise. Maybe I should be more clear. All right, everybody done? Okay, so now I'm gonna shout out some of these words, and I'm gonna tell you where they are placed after you tell me whether you have them or not. So how many of you wrote down the word slumber? Ooh. So we're talking about, I don't know, 80% of you. So slumber was the first word on the top left. How many of you wrote down the word pillow? Oh, even more. Okay. So pillow was the first word on the top right. How many of you wrote down the word blanket? Okay, so we're down to probably less than 50%, which is good. So blanket was the third word on the right column, so it was the middle word in the right column. So you guys you haven't really got it down. How many of you wrote down the word sleep? Okay, so about the same amount as the word blanket. I got news for you. There is no word sleep. Now, those of you who laugh at the guys who wrote down the word sleep, they actually won. Like, this is the actual good answer. They are more likely to be systems thinkers than the rest of them. No, I'm joking. It's just a random exercise. But the funny thing about that, and my friend Alberta Soranzo, who's the end-to-end service design and systems thinking director of Lloyd's Banking Group in London, she spoke at Canucks, I think last year. But we were chatting one night and we were talking about systems and how systems are applied in banking and so on. And she told me this quote that I've been sort of using ever since, shamelessly. She says that once you see a system, you cannot unsee it. And what she means by that is not just a particular system, but once you start looking at the problem and you kind of look above the zoom where the problem really resides, you're going to see either a service or a system. And once you get used to seeing those services and systems, it's going to be really hard for you to look at a problem simply by looking at the feature level or the artifact level or even the product level to some extent. Right? Ultimately, that's going to make you a better designer. Design skills. Probably most of you have heard of some way of looking at the scale of design. Maybe some of you have heard of the IMSS Power of 10 video documentary from 1977. Raise your hand if you've seen this. So some of you. So this is a 7-minute video that was commissioned by IBM in 1977 based on a book called Cosmic View, the Universe in 40 Jumps, written by Keith Bleaky in 1957. But basically what this is it starts with the image, with this particular image. This is an image that shows an area of 1 meter by 1 meter, and every 10 seconds it zooms out for, I guess, 25 times, so up exponentially up to the 10th of the power of 25, which is 100 million light years away from Earth, right? So some of these are some of those examples. This is the 1 meter, this is the 10 meter view, this is the 100 meter view, this is the kilometer view, this is the 10 kilometer view, this is Chicago Harbor, and then it goes up from there up until the edge of what's the visible universe for us. And then it zooms back down to, like, again, exponentially 10 seconds, every 10 seconds, 10 times, to 0.00001 angstroms, which is the size of a proton, right? Which is sort of the smallest element that humans can observe with a microscope. So that's one way of looking at scale. But as a designer, right, we work on artifacts, we work on products, we work on services. It's really hard to place those. If you're familiar with Jared Spool's design resolutions, so he did a talk at Canucks 2 years ago. He was the closing keynote, and he showed what he considers the resolutions of which we design. So there's a screen resolution, there's an application resolution, there's an organizational resolution, and there's an ecosystem resolution. Now, for all of those, like for the other three, so screen, application, organization, he applies all the typical tools that we apply as designers. So if you think of any sort of design thinking method or user-centered design method, that's what he sort of enlists for those first two levels. But when he gets to the ecosystem layer, he just says, I don't know what the tools are. I kind of disagree with the way he's looking at this. Mainly because what happens if you're not a digital company? What happens if you don't design for the screen? What happens if you make bricks? Right? You automatically jump to the organizational resolution. And if you do, organizations are of different scale. You can have an organization of 3 people, like my company, and you can have Amazon, which is a $1 trillion plus company. Do you think that designing for my company or designing for Amazon is a different proposition? I think so, right? So I think that organizational resolution is a little bit misleading. So I created my own design skill. So you can use this design skill for the purpose of today. Now, I'm not saying this is right. I'm not saying anybody else is wrong. I'm just saying, theoretically, well, when we're going through the rest of the presentation today, this is what I want you guys to think in terms of the design skills and the design methods that are being applied. So think of this as sort of an onion peel type layer, where on the left we have the design skill name, and on the right we have the methods that are applicable. So first, I think of foundational skill, or foundational level. And that's where we either create or choose our color palette, our typography, our design principles, right? So a lot of this work is very theoretical. There's limited research that's being sort of required to sort of make the choice of those foundational layer elements. Then we have an artifact layer. And this is where typically the more artistic endeavor of design comes in, right? So that's where we create our icons, our widgets, our logos, our posters, packaging, sound, video, motion, micro interactions and interactions, right? So we can still do these with limited research or no research at all, right? And there are a lot of designers who make a living, and quite a good living at that, at this artifact level. So if you guys are familiar with Aaron Draplin, all he does is logos and posters, right? But he's really well known. He's been doing this his entire career, and he's made a great career out of it. Then we have feature level, right? So again, these are onion peel models, so every level contains everything that's underneath it plus what goes beside it. So when we're talking about a feature level, this is probably what most of you, when you came out of school and you started working for a company, probably one of the first things that you got to work on was, to work on a feature or part of a feature. Now, unlike the first 2 levels, now having being able to employ basic IA techniques like task analysis, being able to sketch, being able to prototype, being able to wireframe, being able to figure out all the fidelities of prototyping that are involved, that's what will make you really effective at the feature level. When you put features together, you have a product. And when you're designing the product, more advanced IA principles come in, right? So it's a car, so the user flow, site maps. So the content strategy comes in a little bit as well. If it's a physical product, we're talking about ergonomics and human factors, right? So your tool-based knowledge has to go up every single time you start designing those. When we're talking about services, right? Services are typically collections of people and products and policies and potentially infrastructure. But our tools have changed as well. So now we're talking about journey maps, we're talking about service blueprints, we're talking about service safaris, we're talking about business origami, experience maps, the 16x framework. And there's a lot of those coming up in service design. But that's typically where the general knowledge of a designer coming out of school ends. But there's other layers as well. So if you think of systems or ecosystems, ecosystems are collections of products, services, humans, right? And there are ways, and system thinking has been around since the 70s, and it's typically part of sort of graduate economics classes. But they've had CLBs or causal loop diagrams. They have stock and flow diagrams. They have system maps, right? But also from a design perspective, by now a lot of people are working on things like journey atlases. Are you guys familiar with journey atlases? Raise your hand. Okay, cool. We can cover those later. Ecosystem maps, which is a big part of what we'll cover after the break. Things like worldly maps, and there's different approaches to system level design, like systemic design, which I'm going to show you briefly at the end of the presentation. I also argued that there is a global level, right? So not just a system level, but a level where we truly don't know what the tools that need to be applied are, because we're really bad at fixing the global level problems that we have. So things like climate change and poverty and the 1% owning most of more than half of the human wealth. But the tools that some people are proposing for that are things like quantum superposition. So that's imagining multiple futures happening in parallel at the same time, or things like design fiction. So if you go to any sort of futures conference, and there's quite a few on the circuit right now. These are people trying to think about these global landscapes or global level landscapes. When we look at a problem at the artifact or foundational level, typically it's like looking at the problem from microscope. When we look at it at the global ecosystem or even service level, if the service is wide enough, think of it as looking at it as from the lens of a telescope. Now, we can design something, and traditionally we've always designed things inside out, so we always, always, I shouldn't say always, but we used to start with picking the color palette, picking the fonts, picking the type of buttons, then figuring out what the icons are, and then sort of starting building a couple of features, releasing a product, and then adding features, and so on. Nowadays, more and more, as things become more complex, we start at the system or the service level, and we start sort of going down the other way. Now, these approaches are quite different, and the reason they're different is a lot into what we're trying to get out of it. So if you think about sort of foundational artifact feature product level, the focus is on the artifact, right? It's all about being pixel perfect. It's all about precision. You want to put something out there. You think of, the quintessential example of Apple products, right? They are polished and they are, exactly what you want them to be. Versus, if you look at something at the service system or global level, the focus is about understanding. It's all about being imprecise. It's all about flexibility, right? We don't have the same goals when we try to design those two different things. Another thing that's different, and I alluded to this earlier, is the research coverage. So when we research a feature, we can typically cover that space pretty well, right? We can do user research in advance, we can do competitive research, you can do design research, you can co-create with users, you can do usability testing, right? So by the time you're done with this feature, you pretty much know that it's going to go well. When you're doing this at the product level, maybe you're not going to talk to every single type of user, maybe you're not going to hit every single corner, but still, you're going to do pretty well if you have a good budget for research to cover most of the problem space. When you're talking about the service, it's getting a little bit dicey, right? Services have multiple products typically, they have multiple actors, you have to worry about multiple personas, you have to worry about how those personas interact with each of the products that are part of the service, you have to worry about policy, you have to worry about all kinds of other things. So now your research is not going to be as comprehensive as it was for feature and product level stuff. And then when we're talking about the system, that's where this adaptive thinking comes in, where your research is very limited and you have to make those shot in the dark decisions if you truly want to affect what a system's outcome is. Let's talk about the role of a designer. So if you're a designer, and I'm not saying this is the only role of a designer, designers do a lot of different things, but one of the roles of a designer is to be able to visualize the environment in which a user operates in order to inform making better product decisions, right? So this is why we do research, this is why we prototype, right? To inform making those better product decisions. Now, as you move into your career and you want to be a design leader, a design strategist, that changes. So nowadays, a design strategist's role, and one of its roles, is to be able to visualize the environment in which the business, as opposed to the user, operates, in order to inform making better strategic decisions rather than product decisions. Right? Which brings me to systems. Now, before we define what a system is for the purpose of today, let's talk about what isn't the system. Do you guys think a brick is a system? Raise your hand. Who thinks a brick is a system? All right, there's a couple of people. So, from a human scale perspective, a brick is not a system. If you're looking at it from sort of a microscopic perspective, sure, a brick is a system of I guess, chemical components that are sort of meshed together and melted together into a brick. But from a human scale perspective, a brick is just a product. Is a nail a system? No? Same as the brick, right? Is a book a system? Okay, so now we're like 50-50. People are typically 50-50 about a book as well. Is a shelf a system? Just a plank? No, right? But when you put this together, right? So if you put your books on a shelf and you put your bricks on each side and you nail this to the wall, all of a sudden you have a collection of elements connected to each other that perform functions as a whole. Right? Now, how do you know you have a system? Because if you have subparts that leave that system changes. The behavior of the system changes. So if you have that shelf full of books on the wall and you remove the nails, everything's going to fall on the floor, things are going to break, your books are not going to be nicely sort of organized together, and it's going to be a big mess, right? So all of a sudden, your system changed completely. Systems thinking is a method for understanding how elements within systems are related and the functions they perform, and especially how they influence one another. Now, you guys are all, I'm assuming, who's not familiar with design thinking here? I would hope that most of you are. Okay, cool. So let's juxtapose design thinking and systems thinking just to see how they're different. So in design thinking, the focus is on the user, right? When you're talking about systems thinking, the focus is actually on the system. In design thinking, if you think about all your design thinking methodology, the process is typically linear as opposed to systems thinking where the process is typically non-linear and it's layered, right? So you have multiple layers to shoot the problem. When you look at design thinking, you're typically looking at analysis and synthesis, right? Those are sort of the typical ways of sort of problem solving that you're looking at. But when you're looking at systems thinking, you also have to add what's called big picture thinking to that as well. Design thinking is driven by designers, right? So all the artifacts that are typically related to design thinking, sure, designers facilitate some of that work, but they own the artifact. In systems thinking, designers do not own the artifact. Designers facilitate whatever the understanding that needs to happen at the problem level in the system. So it's driven collectively. We already covered this. Design thinking typically requires deductive and inductive thinking. Systems thinking requires that inductive thinking, that shot in the dark kind of reasoning. And design thinking has a fairly narrow focus, so it's a problem that's fairly easy to understand. Systems thinking, it's all about understanding what the problem is, right? It's all about figuring out what the boundary of the problems is and figuring out what the boundaries of the systems related to the problem are. Now, when you're taking a course in systems thinking, like I said, this is typically a graduate level economics course, the first thing that you're being taught are something that's called causal loop diagrams. Anybody familiar with causal loop diagrams? One person, two people, three-ish, okay. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of what those are, because this is the basis of how people think about systems. So causal loop diagrams are the first thing that try to frame, to move our framing away from linear cause and effect to sort of more circular thinking. In order to build the causal loop diagrams, you basically think of the concepts, and you sort of list those down as textual identifiers, and then you connect them using arrows, right? Fairly simple. All designers should be able to do this. To give you an example, a lot of people think that if you have a problem In linear thinking, you apply an action, and that action solves the problem, right? That works really well if your problem is I'm trying to, turn off the oven, or I'm trying to turn off the water, or something sort of that's very contained. But if the problem is something more complex, what happens is something like this. You have a problem, and you apply certain action to it, and that action changes the parameters of the problem. And then you can apply that action or a different action again, and that again changes the problem, right? The problem changes very slowly over time, right? So this is the basis of systems thinking. To give you an example, if you want to see, and this is sort of a quintessential causal loop diagram example, showing how a population is affected by the number of birds and deaths, you just basically put those labels out, and then you draw an arrow between population and birds, and then you think about what happens if any of those quantities go up and down. So in a certain population, if the number of birds goes up, then the population goes up, right? So you annotate this with either a plus or a minus on those arrows. If a population goes up, the number of deaths also goes up. But once the number of deaths go up, the population goes down, right? So these are two causal loop diagrams. You have a causal diagram between population and birds, and then you have one between population and deaths. Because in the diagram, in the loop between population and birds, the loop goes in the same direction. So if one of the entities' quantity goes up, the other one also goes up. It's called the reinforcing loop. So if the population went down and birds went down, that's also a reinforcing loop as long as it keeps going in the same direction. Versus population and deaths, if the population goes up, the number of deaths goes up, but once the number of deaths goes up, the population goes down. That's called the balancing loop, right? Where the direction in which you start is not the direction in which you close the loop. Now this is a very, very simple causal diagram. They get really, really crazy. There's actual tools that allow you to sort of put these together. Now, when I was looking from a design perspective at how I could help the business to understand the problem, and I was looking at this kind of software, of course, anybody who I tried to even have a conversation about this, they looked at it and said, well, nah, that's not going to do it. I can't speak that. In fact, in the systems thinking world, these are affectionately known as spaghetti diagrams. And you can kind of see why. Now, people have started to do the system maps for a very long time, but now system thinkers are starting to look into ecosystem mapping as well. So here's an excerpt of an interview with Travis, and he's a research scientist, and he does a lot of ecosystem mapping.
When you're doing ecosystem mapping, there's no secret or hidden knowledge that you need in order to do it. Anybody can do it. You just get a whole stack of sticky notes and some kind of blank wall, and you start without even thinking about it, just writing out places that your technology could go. So for us, for batteries, we would write out drones and electric vehicles and consumer electronics, cell phones, tablets, all these things, and just sticking them on a wall at random. And then once you finish that, you kind of take a step back and you look at it and you say, well, these things are kind of related to each other, and you start moving the stickies around to cluster them together.
Right? So you think about where your technology can go. So that's like solutioning 101. And then you just cluster it all together, which is the definition of the cluster map, and somehow you end up with an ecosystem map. So I have to do a little bit more digging. So what is an ecosystem? I'm assuming that most of you have heard of ecosystems from biology, right, to some extent. But now ecosystems have become part of our ontology. So anything that's basically a set of concepts or categories in a subject area or domain that shows properties and relationships between them now have semantically drifted into what's called an ecosystem. Ecosystem is also now a buzzword. So this is actually an old article. This is from 2014, so this is 5 years old now, more than 5 years old, where people are talking about ecosystem as the next business buzzword. The funny part about this is that the author of this has this tagline as, I create ecosystems that empower innovators and dreamers. So there's doesn't get any more buzzwordy than that. I'm a big basketball fan, so earlier this year during the March Madness at the NCAA tournament, LinkedIn came up with instead of buzzer beater bracket, but a buzzword beaters bracket. And funny enough, ecosystem was the #1 seed in the cliche category. So I thought that was kind of interesting, although they were upset in the Sweet 16 by growth hacks. Now, the types of ecosystems that we have, the type of traditional ecosystems that we've had in UX are related to platform ecosystems. So this is very similar to what I showed you that Pitney Bowes had, that you put your sort of company logo in the middle and you can add every single product or software, whatever, around it, right? So if you think of a Microsoft product ecosystem or platform ecosystem, you add your Outlook, your cloud stuff, your PowerPoint, your Word, and so on. So anything you can think of, just put it around and say, this is my platform ecosystem. There's also device ecosystem. So there was a book written by Carl Levin from Google in 2011 when mobile first was sort of the preferred approach, where she defines how to build ecosystems based on the type of devices that the elements of those, the experience of that ecosystem will be presented on. And that sort of lasted for about 2 years until she realized that that's still sort of premature solution, so that kind of went away. Content ecosystems are a little bit newer. This is a construct that Scott Kuby from Great Traffic, which is an algorithms company out of Minnesota, has devised, and that's more related to how content moves through all the elements of a particular service or a particular system. But those tools and those methods are still inadequate for what we're trying to do at the system level. How do we get here? My apologies for this. I know this thing. You're familiar with journey maps, right? Who's not familiar with journey maps? Okay. Now, I'm going to talk you through journey map atlases, because earlier on, when I asked you about journey map atlases, nobody here said that they've kind of seen those. Has anybody seen journey map atlases? Can I talk over these or no? Okay. So journey map atlases are a system-level tool, and it's used for cataloging and assessing journey maps to help organizations systematically plan and prioritize journey mapping efforts. So I'm old, and when I was a kid all the way through my teenage years, we didn't have Google Maps. We had these books that were sort of tiny, and they were called map atlases. And in there, you had the big picture of an entire country or continent on the front page, and it was sort of separated into columns, so blue squares, so you had column names, and then you had columns at the top and numbers on the right and left. So then you had corresponding pages that you have to kind of look up if you wanted to see the details of a particular area. So I feel like this is kind of how people came up with journey map atlases. I don't know exactly who came up with it. I know that the Nielsen Norman Group are the ones that are teaching a lot of sort of journey map atlas workshops and activities out there. But basically, what they do is they organize journeys, so journey maps, which you guys are all familiar with, into chapters, so stages into a customer life cycle. And these individual journeys can span more than one chapter. On top of that, you overlay the journey health and the journey importance, and you've got yourself a journey map atlas. What does it look like? So if you're looking at an a health insurance company, for example, these would be your chapters at the top. Your individual journeys would look like something like this. And this is just an example. Now, like I said, you need to be able to identify which ones are the important ones. So again, you have to kind of do a bunch of research and figure out what the problem you're trying to solve by doing these. And then you have to basically add the health of these journeys. And hopefully, once you've done this, you'll be able to sort of go in on these high importance journeys and flush those all out and figure out how to improve them, right? But that's typically what a journey map atlas looks like. How to create a journey map atlas? These are the steps that they define, so establishing focus, defining journey chapters, identifying the persona's goals. So you're still doing a journey map atlas from the perspective of the persona. You plot journeys across the atlas, and then you prioritize important journeys for deep dives. Make sense? All right. Do you want to take a break? I have about less than half an hour of content, and I know that Tom said that he wanted to do a break for announcements. So I have one more piece about ecosystem mapping and how to do those. I don't know if you want to do that right now, or you want me to finish and finish? Break. Right. Break it is. So 15-minute break? Typically employ when we're talking about mapping systems. This is called ecosystem mapping. Now, as a definition, and this is a definition that I adapted from Sophia Hussein, who was one of the first designers who were trying to understand how it can be useful at the system level. So I call ecosystem mapping a collaborative process that helps companies visualize and map the service components and the relationship between services within the space or the ecosystem that they operate in. Now, I typically do these in an ecosystem mapping workshop, or I sneak them in a discovery workshop. In order to be able to do one of these workshops, again, because we're talking about a system level, you have to think big, but you have to think just big enough, right? Because boundary setting is really important, and you can easily go overboard with the type of boundaries that you set. Collaboration is magic. So again, this is not something at the system level. None of these deliverables are things that we own. And none of these deliverables become useful unless you're involving other people who have data that you can overlay on top of these visualizations. When you create them, you need to iterate. When you want to iterate, we're all familiar with our #1 tool, the Post-it, but you want to use dry erase boards. You don't want to commit to structure very early, because you want to be able to move things around, especially if you're going to try to map out pathways and need to cluster things and so on. Ecosystem elements are typically polymorphous. So to give an example, any individual element could be either an actor or a touch point for another actor. So again, if you think back about those 4 quadrants in systems thinking and where systems come from, you need to look at systems from multiple perspectives. And depending on the perspective that you're looking at, elements of that ecosystem are going to be either an actor or a touch point. Now, the process itself is a 6-step process. The first one, you need to do your research, user research, design research, but most importantly, competitive research. This is something that designers are not particularly good at. If you talk to people who do market research and competitive research, you realize that there's a lot that you don't know in that space. The second part is drawing a rich picture of the system, and there's an asterisk beside it, and I'll tell you why that is when we get to that. And then we identify the primary actors. Now, I call this the research and definition phase. Once we have identified the primary actors, we can now figure out what our primary service clusters are and group them together. We then expand and set boundaries. And then the last piece, but also the most important piece, is being able to calibrate and apply lenses to this visualization. Now, this is called the synthesis and visual exploration phase. If some of these look familiar, it's because the first 3 are pretty important tenets of design thinking, and the last 3 are very common tenets of systems thinking. Here's an actual case study. So the first time I ever worked with this methodology, and it was an earlier version of this methodology, but I was approached by an existing storage company with locations across Western Canada. They were exploring to expand their business and switch some of their locations into retirement homes. And that, you might look at that and be like, I have no idea how they approached the designer to do this. They didn't at first. So they hired the risk company. They got back a really big blue binder, and they told them that your chances of being able to be successful at this are 0.7 or 70% in human talk. And they didn't know what that means. And they went through that binder, there was a lot of risk assessments, there was a lot of financials, there was a lot of other stuff, but they really couldn't visualize what does that really mean for them. Now, you might think also that might be a bad idea. Why would somebody, who's doing really good business as a storage company want to be a retirement home? We're all familiar, I'm presuming, with sort of the population aging that's happening in Canada. If you think about storage units, at least in my geography, if you want to rent, 8-foot by 12-foot storage unit, that costs you about $150 a month. So if you were to rent 3 of those, that would be about $450 a month. But if you were to combine those into a unit, into a studio for a retirement home, that would command prices at least 3 times as that, right? So from a business perspective, that's potentially a lot of windfall that can come out of that. So I started by, so initially they came to me because they heard from one of my friends that I work sort of with business stakeholders, and I kind of try to help them solve some business problems. This is not what I had in mind at the time at all. But we started doing research. So I worked with a researcher. We started kind of knocking on doors of retirement homes in the area. And of course, when we told them what we were up to and who we represent, everybody was like, closing the door in our faces. We're not going to tell you anything. We don't want to have extra competition, especially people who are coming in with a bit of a different mindset. So we switched. So we started doing sort of some guerrilla research where we pretended we were going to put our parents into a retirement home. And then all of a sudden we found out all the goodies. So that's how that whole thing started. I mentioned competitive research. Typically when we do competitive research, we focus on what other retirement homes were doing in terms of the products and service offering, the types of customers they were serving, pricing, and feature differentiators. So this is typically how I used to think about competitive research. I used to put all of these in a spreadsheet and kind of make a call as to what's worth sort of duplicating or imitating going forward. But when I started talking to other people who do this for a living, I learned other techniques like the imitability ladder, like the offer differentiation analysis, which I think should become more and more part of the repertoire of researchers or people who have a research background in order to be able to do competitive research at this system scale. Next step. Drawing a rich picture of the system. Now, rich pictures, you may not be familiar with them, but you're probably familiar with them. So rich picture is a pictorial summary of the actual situation in the systems world based on inquiries and observations in the real world. Right? So it sounds a lot like the kind of research that we do. What do these rich pictures look like? This is a rich picture about the construction of the Humber Bridge that was drawn in 1994. By Stewart and Fortune. This is one of the most sort of famous rich pictures out there. But basically, a rich picture just allows you to tell the story about a particular problem. So in this case, if you're trying to build a bridge, you have all the elements here that would allow you to kind of tell the story about building this bridge. So you need to have a construction company. You need to worry about cost. You need to worry about specifications. You need to worry about the politics of it. You need to have supplies, transport infrastructure. You need to pay attention to the geology. You need to communicate, you need to worry about the weather, so you don't want to build that bridge in the winter. You need to worry about the economy and all the government regulations and the health and safety inspectorate. Right? So even if I'm not a bridge builder, I never built a bridge, I can just look at this and kind of give you an idea of what the problem is that I'm trying to solve at a system level when I'm building a bridge. Now, I told you there was an asterisk beside this third step in the methodology. That's because rich pictures are my sort of quickest way that I could identify in doing these things. But you can replace those. You can replace the rich pictures with anything that allows you to quickly visualize real life elements of the system. So you can use mind maps or cluster maps or concept maps. You can, if you so choose, use business origami and actually have a more interactive activity to get there. You can use game cards, you can do servicifiers, you can use whatever you want, whatever works for you. So far for me, this is the fastest way that I've been able to do this. Rich pictures are another way for, like, you guys are familiar with scheduling, right? You go to a conference, you see a lot of people watching a talk, and then distilling that talk in some sort of a sketch note. Think of this as a sketch note of a system. What did it look for me? So this is the actual sketch that I made at home before blowing it up on the whiteboard, because we want to start with this and make them big, and like I said, we want to add layers and layers of post-it notes, connections, and so on. But I said, you guys are a storage company, you want to become a seniors company, so you probably want to do some augmentation to your locations. Then you have a retiree. They want to retire. I don't know why they look like Princess Leia, but this is the level of graphics that I can do. They want to retire, but they also want to keep in touch with friends and family, whether by phone or by internet or in person or whatever. As they retire, their life, their health might deteriorate, so they might need access to a doctor a bit more frequently. Just because they retire doesn't mean that they want to stop doing their lives. They want to play tennis, they want to play golf. But as they do, they need a CPR or they need a defibrillator close by, just in case. They still want to go and be a part of the community, whether it's a community center or whether they want to travel the world. But because they're moving down from a probably larger house or apartment, good news, it's a storage company. Just because you have access to a doctor, you might actually have bigger problems, so you might need to go to a hospital, you might need access to medicine, and then within a 24-hour sort of revolving daily activity, you might still need access to somebody preparing food for you, somebody washing your clothes, potentially help with bathing depending on mobility impairments, as well as some sort of monitoring and security on top of all that. So this is what the bridge picture that I started with looked like. Then the next step was identifying the primary actors. What are the actors in the system? So again, starting with the rich picture that was built, and then I started sort of putting in all the entities that I see that could potentially play a part in this. And there's a lot more, but this is just for the purpose of this visualization. So I have the company, I have the retirees, I have the family, doctors, security personnel, cooks, drivers, nurses, emergency medical people, and so on. There's clearly a lot more. Now, if you want to identify who the primary actors are, it's very simple. You need to ask yourself the question, which one of these actors are the people who can actually, are the entities who can actually judge whether the quality of the experience provided by these services is good or bad. And that typically narrows it down quite a bit. So in this case, it's either the retirees, because they're the sort of end user of this ecosystem. It's their families, because in a lot of cases, the families act as a proxy for the retirees, or it's the company itself. Now, because the families are a proxy, we just kind of discarded them because the retirees are sort of they have the first-hand experience. But the company is up there too, because they can say, we can judge whether the services offered are good or bad based on the number of people who actually signed up for our retirement. So we challenged that, and we said, well, people might not necessarily sign up for a retirement home just because you have really good services, but you might be the only company in a particular geography, you might have lower prices, there might be a lot of other things that come into play. So for us, the primary actor ended up being the retirees. Now, remember, when you map the ecosystem, you need to map it from at least two different perspectives, right? So we're talking about systems thinking being a holistic way of looking at the problem, but from more than one perspective. So when you map something, it's a good idea to map it from both an internal and external perspective. So in this case, we map this out from the perspective of the retirees, but we also map it out from the perspective of the company. Grouping primary service clusters. What are the service clusters in here? So let's think about some of the services that are being offered. And these are exactly the things that I talked to you about before. So you would put these on Post-it notes, and then you would just kind of slowly fill in your board with the Post-its as you have them. Then you will start clustering them. So clustering them, This is your typical open card sort. Everybody's familiar with those. You try to kind of figure out what those thematic clusters are in terms of the services that are being offered. What does that look like? So if I take these and I just color code them, again, I'm doing a presentation, so I take some liberties, and then I rearrange them. Right? This is how we cluster them. This is how our open sort turned out, and then the main clusters following sort of a similar methodology. So we had daily assistance activities, we had housing needs activities, we had enjoying social activities, we had access to transportation services, access to emergency services, and last but not least, access to medical assistance. And again, all of these were from the perspective of the retirees. So when we're looking at the base of this ecosystem map, the service layer base of this ecosystem map, this is what it looked like. We can narrow it down. If you just care about sort of that first layer, this is what it looks like. But we needed to expand it. So again, next step, expanding and setting boundaries. Now I'm going through this really, really fast. This typically takes about half a day to kind of do it properly. Expanding and setting the boundary. So I'm expanding to this first layer, but then competitive analysis a lot of times helps with figuring out what additional satellite services can be used as part of this ecosystem. So I'm going to rotate this a little bit. So if you're enjoying social activities, and you can enjoy social activities at the location of the retirement home, but you can also potentially want to visit a community center. You can partner with a community center and offer a bunch of services that are related. Or if your enjoy social activities requires you to travel, if that's what your preferred social activity is, you might actually decide to have a travel agent that comes part-time on staff. Same with pharmaceutical services that I have up here. Same with medical insurance, right? You can expand the service offering of your ecosystem smartly in such a way that your product offering positions you better as a business within that system. This is what the level one of the primary services are that we initially discovered, and this is sort of the second layer of secondary services as we uncover more. There's a few more of these that they didn't let me sort of put out because they consider them a competitive advantage. So just bear that in mind. Now, when we have this base layer of services, we can think of some of the journeys that are happening within. So if somebody needed to have access to medical assistance, they probably needed access to transportation, they either needed access to nurse services, they needed access to medical records, they could possibly require access to a hospital, then medical insurance at the hospital, and possibly consequently pharmaceutical services. Same with what we talked before about enjoying social activities at the community center or on premises. You need access to transportation, you need to be able to register, you need to attend those classes, and you need to get yourself there and back. And there's, you can make this close to what a spaghetti diagram looks like if you want to start mapping everything that's there. But you typically want to figure out what your sort of more meaningful activities are. Now, why I chose this type of underlayer for the system, I read this article called Digital Ecosystems, Ecosystem-Oriented Architectures by Briscoe, Sabine, and Wild, and they were talking about that this is sort of the natural shape of an ecosystem map, right? Or a system maps the way that they're being done by economics folks with all those sorts of spaghetti diagrams are really hard to sort of follow, but if you can map them like this, like more like a network map, they become a little bit easier to understand. Once we figured out what those primary and secondary layers of systems are, we need to figure out what the ecosystem boundaries are. Why this is important? Especially the first couple of times we're going to be doing this, definitely the first time we're going to be doing this, we're going to have a hard time deciding what the right boundary for the ecosystem is. In some cases, you're going to pick your services in a funny way. So the way I pick my services for the service layer is basically using a JTBD methodology, right? So jobs to be done. What are the jobs that I'm hiring the system to do for that particular primary user? And it's all at the system level. So they're all verbs. There are no technology there. There's no technology there. There are no solutions. They're all sort of uniformly described. When we're talking about ecosystem boundaries, there's other considerations that come into play. The first one, and I think this one is really important, a lot of people don't pay attention to, is ethics, right? When we're trying to address issues or we're trying to solve a problem, when we're designing something, we typically only have visibility to the end of our line of inquiry, right? So a lot of times, so if you think about all the bad things that happen with Facebook, and Facebook have outed people who are minority in some way that were not publicly outed, or some of the things that are happening with political ads, or some of the really nasty things that are out there, it all has to do with ethics. And in my opinion, if you want to become an ethical designer, and nowadays everybody talks about an ethical designer, you cannot be that ethical designer unless you're thinking about the problem you're trying to solve at the system level. What that means is that the boundaries of the problem that you're trying to solve has to be fluid, not necessarily for the purpose of solving the problem, but for the purpose of trying to understand whether you're causing harm. And that harm may be one person removed or 10 people removed from the part of the system that you're personally involved in designing. What does this look for us? So we looked at potentially having a part-time clinic, if that was something that they'd be able to do, and that would have given them a huge advantage compared to other retirement homes to have a part-time clinic on site. There was a lot of cost related to that, there was a lot of training related to that, there was a lot of hoops, regulatory hoops that they need to jump through, so that was kind of flashed. We looked at having an insurance agent as well as sort of a small small pharmacy on premises. That also fell through, just because, again, a lot of regulatory hoops and a lot of medical insurance companies actually wanted to be paid extra by being there, not just with the extra business that they would have gained that way. So eventually, this was the sweet spot. This was the boundary that these guys chose as the boundary of the system that they were playing. Last piece, and like I said before, the most important piece, calibrating and applying lenses. So lenses, I read this article, and that's a really great site, systemthinker.com. So if you're sort of starting to look into systems thinking, there's a lot of basics there. There's a lot of really good articles. There's a lot of people who've been doing this for a long time that have really sort of interesting points of view about all of this. But systems thinking, according to this article, is a lens through which you can look at the world, and that lens determines what you see and often influences what you do about it. And that's what influenced a number of people to think of lenses as something that can be applied, which are basically data layers that you can add on top of this service underlayer. Example of lenses. Who are the actors in the system? What devices do they use? To what channels do they communicate? Where does the competition excel? Where in the system are the current pain points? So these are typical things that we care about when we're trying to solve problems. What parts of the system have ethical concerns? If you think about what you guys do when you take a picture, depending on the settings on your camera, so you can change your aperture, you can change your focal length, that will give you a slightly different picture, right? And by looking through those different, looking through the lens in those different settings, you will see possibly things that you haven't seen before. These are some lens examples. There's some more lens examples. You can choose what the lenses are, but usually you need help from other people, from other functions in order to make those lenses. Lenses can be real-world lenses, so we're talking about channels and pathways and so on, or we're talking about sort of more subjective lenses, like something is a risk, something is a pain point in the system. They can be binary, so something is a pain point, something is not a pain point, so you can say something is like 0.75 pain point, or they can be mutually exclusive, and multi-dimensional. So if you think about channels, right, you can have something that is both, an online channel service, but also in-person service, and also telephone service. So those things are multidimensional and complementary in some way. What does this look like? So if I care about actors, I don't know if you guys remember what those actors are, but that's not the point. But I could sort of map out, and again, this is a very sanitized version of the ecosystem map, but I could basically show the current actors that they already have and they're already employing, and the actors that they need to hire in the future. The same thing, this is sort of the part that they're interested in the most. What are the services that they need to provide in order to be competitive, and what do they have them already or not? So the things that have X's on them, and again, the outside doesn't matter all that much because the gray ones are the ones that they decided not to pursue, but on the inside, all the X's are services that they need to be able to provide. Of course, the really important thing with this is how much they cost. So when we were doing this, they pulled in part of this exercise. When we decided to add a financial lens to it all, they invited somebody from the financial department, and we were able to use that blue report that was done by the risk company for them to add some numbers to this, and they can show you actual numbers. So this helped them make a decision, right? They decided to kind of go ahead with the pilot and decided to try this in a small community as opposed to a major city, just to kind of see whether they can hire the right people fast enough and whether they can sort of put this together fast enough. To give you an example of channels, this is just an example. I never actually did this for them. This is just to kind of show you what a multi-dimensional lens looks like, something like this. Now when I do the workshop, the ecosystem mapping workshop, there's a lot of, people go through sort of this whole exercise of mapping an ecosystem, applying lenses, and they typically sort of look like something like this. How does it all fit together? Well, pathways in a service ecosystem map, what you guys have just seen, they can become very easily touch points in a customer journey map, right? So this is how you drill down. So once you identify services in your ecosystem map that are of some importance to you, you can actually drill down and flush out the customer journey maps like they do tonight. Same thing if you care about sort of the system map version of that, you can use those pathways to infer causal loop diagrams at a system level. I'm going to jump over this project. I started by telling you about that 46-foot journey map. And funny enough, at the end of that presentation, just to sort of put it all in perspective, they realized that they kind of snuck in the fact that, maybe that was not our best approach. We should have probably started to do we shouldn't have started to do the journey map for everything. We should have tried to figure out first what are sort of the bigger steps that somebody needs to take in order to get services by that healthcare company. And they started building something that looks like a journey, but it's sort of like circular on, I don't know what. Like, it's really hard to sort of figure out what this was, but it looks kind of like an ecosystem map. But they decided that what they were going to do is they were going to do something like an image map where all of those elements were clickable and you would basically zoom into a part of the journey that way. Now, the funny part about this is that they called the middle layer their ecosystem facets. I don't know if you can read that. It's not really an ecosystem, it's not an ecosystem map at all, but they realized that they needed to sort of move up in scale at least a little bit in order to sort of get this done. Other ecosystem mapping methods, I have like 3 slides left. This is systemic design, so this is a way to approach system scale problems, and this is by the folks at Mars Solution Lab in Toronto, Shift and Naymat, which is 2 sort of innovation companies. I saw this very recently, and I was really happy to kind of see that they look at the combination of design thinking and system thinking, but my equivalent of system system mapping actually is one of these steps. So they they look at the system level problem solving a little bit differently. But the really interesting thing about this is that they have a system map they have a system map template at the understanding the system step here, step number 3, but they also have a bunch of other different templates that you guys can sort of download at that URL, and it kind of gives you different perspectives on how to solve problems from a system level perspective. There's also a book called Orchestrating Experiences by those from media that was written by Chris Houston and Pat Quattlebaum. They have their own ecosystem mapping method, and they're more prescriptive than I am. So they say that for each ecosystem map, you have to add actors, roles, artifacts, places, interactions, relationships, and boundaries. Now, they have some examples that have none of these, so they kind of what they say and what they do is a little bit different, but they show a couple of examples. I would argue that, for example, this particular thing is the journey of a customer within a store could be much easier represented as a journey map rather than what they call an ecosystem map. But we're still, ecosystem mapping at system level thinking from a design perspective is still fairly early. So I encourage you to kind of look at all of these and sort of even make these approaches your own, right? Because we're still in that sort of inception period for some of these tools. And last but not least, we have Sophia Hussein's ecosystem mapping approach. This is a sort of an older approach where she's trying to add a time dimension to this, but this is still very much journey oriented. My last thought is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Luca Bruschi's mobile first approach. Yeah. That seemed to be sort of the de facto way that design was kind of going to about 5-6 years ago. If you want to build a good product, if you want to build a good service, you want to figure out first how it would work to the mobile channel. If you can get it working well to the mobile channel, then most likely that's going to be successful. I think, given what's happening in the last 5 years in the world, we've all realized that that's not necessarily the right approach. So I would encourage you to look at things a bit of a different lens. Thank you.